Welcome to today's webinar, Smart Growth in the Midwest, an overview of policies and practice, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA Office of Sustainable Communities and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars like today's Smart Growth in the Midwest, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, which is your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide timely news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We will be recording this webinar and will post it on our website. We encourage you to visit our website and subscribe to our weekly e-newsletter to get the latest nationwide information about smart growth and to learn about upcoming webinars. You can also find out about other planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits for this webinar, log into your account on the American Planning Association's website and search the name of today's event, Smart Growth in the Midwest, an overview of policies and practice, or use event number 913-2013. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. So today we are excited to present Smart Growth in the Midwest, an overview of policies and practice. Today's webinar will look at the concept of smart growth and how it has influenced planning and development in America's heartland through the lenses of planning consultants working in communities throughout the upper Midwest. Our experts today are Jason Valerius, Stephanie Brown, and Christopher Jansen of MSA Professional Services, a firm with more than 15 years of community planning and design experience across the Midwest. Based in Madison, Jason is chair of the Planning Community of Practice at MSA and co-author of Becoming an Urban Planner, A Guide to Careers in Planning and Urban Design. He has led the development of comprehensive plans, neighborhood plans, and zoning ordinances. Trained in both urban planning and architecture, he has applied his urban design expertise to the creation of design standards and guidelines for municipalities and the design and entitlement process for private development. Stephanie Brown serves as a project planner for Central Illinois. She previously worked for 5 years as a development planner in the city of Decatur, Illinois, where she gained municipal experience with historic preservation, community development, sustainable planning, downtown revitalization, and creating and implementing municipal regulatory tools. Christopher Jansen serves as a planning team leader in MSA's Iowa region. In this role, he focuses on serving municipal clients in the areas of housing program management, comprehensive planning, development administration, project financing, funding administration, GIS mapping, and development implementation. Following the presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can ask a question anytime during the presentation using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I will turn it over to Jason to get us started. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. So, Michael, we appreciate your invitation to share our perspective on smart growth planning and development with your audience. Stephanie and Chris and I do work broadly, I'd say, across the upper Midwest, predominantly in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And a lot of that is comprehensive planning, and then also the the next steps, the more detailed steps that flow from comprehensive planning, neighborhood plans and zoning ordinance work and the like. And we thought that it would be interesting and useful to reflect on smart growth principles as they are commonly understood and talked about, and to relate that to the state statutes and state enabling laws that influence the way that planning occurs in the states where we work. And then to look at how all of that influences planning practice and plans that result in the areas where we work, and then obviously how that affects actual built outcomes, how that affects development practices. So again, this is just in the 4 states where we work, and we that's primarily our area of expertise and where we'll be talking about. So to talk about what is smart growth, these are definitions that are probably familiar to many. Maybe you haven't seen them recently, but I've got a couple, and I'll read just the bolded portion. And this comes from the Smart Growth Network's website. Definition offered is that smart growth covers a range of development and conservation strategies that help protect our health and natural environment and makes our communities more attractive, economically stronger, and more socially diverse. And then it's followed up with a set of 10 basic principles. And most of those principles relate to the built environment, the end result, but a portion of them are also about the process, and so I highlighted those with in red there. And then I also grabbed a definition from the APA. So their version here is smart growth is not a single tool, but a set of cohesive urban and regional planning principles that can be blended together and melded with unique local and regional conditions to achieve a better development pattern. Smart growth is an approach to achieving communities that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. Smart growth provides choices in housing, transportation, jobs, and amenities, including cultural, social services, recreational, educational, among others. Using comprehensive planning to guide, design, develop, manage, revitalize, and build inclusive communities and regions. And then APA also has a set of principles. And keeping with the theme, they're a little wordier here. There's more of them, but so we've got a set of 16 principles, and again, I've highlighted the 3 that jumped out to be as really being more about process than about end result, about getting people involved in the process, about being multidisciplinary in approach, and to being collaborative among various institutions and other governments, etc. So that's kind of a reminder of what smart growth is, and so the question is, how do Midwestern planning and development practices stack up against these common smart growth principles? And we took a step back to ask ourselves this and reflect on what we do and what we see, and our primary answer is that there's really very little difference between what we do and what we see as the generally accepted norms for smart growth. This is what we see, and this is what we do. So, for example, we see a lot of commitment to and interest in planning for the success of downtowns, in downtown revitalization. So this comes from a recent plan we did for La Crescent, Minnesota, envisioning some new infill redevelopment, new streetscaping, and we see that not only in plans but in outcomes. And so this image from Waunakee, Wisconsin, shows new infill redevelopment that has occurred, shows bike lanes, shows attention to detail with streetscaping. All of this reflecting many of the principles of smart growth I think are easy to find in many plans and in many downtowns as they relate to the downtown in particular. So we see a desire for mixed use, and often that's being achieved. We see bike lanes and sidewalks and multimodal transportation. We see effort and investment and money and agreement that this is the right thing to do. So very much a lot of consistency there. We're also seeing greater comfort in, I think, most of the communities we work, we're seeing greater comfort with building height and a greater appreciation for more efficient and more compact land use. And you know, the definition of tall, the definition of dense, as I think we all know, varies depending on the community that you're in and the people that you're talking to. So in some cases that's 3 stories, and your debate is about whether it's okay or even imperative that we get to 3 stories in the downtown. In other cases it's 23 or more. So this happens to be in Champaign, but we are seeing more height and we are seeing greater land use efficiency in downtowns, in urban centers and community centers. We're also seeing a commitment to and an interest in housing. So this isn't a good photo of, this isn't a photo of good housing, but this is a photo from a community that we've done work in that wanted to focus specifically on housing and to tackle questions about what is the housing mix? What is the right housing mix that we should have? How can we spur redevelopment in existing neighborhoods and renew or replace homes like this so that neighborhoods are healthy? And all of that very much consistent with smart growth, and something that in this case happened to be not part of a comp plan but flowed from it, where the comprehensive plan said, you know, we really need to focus on housing, and so we did. We're also seeing a commitment to and an investment in recreational amenities such as pools and trails. Here we've got the mayor of Appleton, Wisconsin at the grand opening of their pool, just walking around in the pool in his suit. On the right is a new bike path that opened in the Madison area just in the past week, connecting a community that hadn't really been connected to the rest of the metro area by with good biking and walking amenities through a wetland and across a lake. So and we see this everywhere. The trend and interest in recreation is I think uniformly appreciated in our communities as something that's of value to people and about making places better places to live. So again, consistent with smart growth. The stakeholder engagement process we think is commonly understood as a good thing, and we are seeing comp plans and the comp planning process is being used to engage people and to make the development process more predictable. So plans being used to get people involved in the process of talking about development before the developer comes to the table, and then when the developer comes to the table, we're seeing processes going more smoothly as a result. So there's a but, and the but is that there's a second answer to the question of what we're seeing, and that is that policy choices and outcomes are very different in rural communities. And this is probably not, I'm fairly certain this is not a Midwestern thing. I think it's common across the country, but again, what is the Midwestern experience? Very much this fact. So what does that mean? I think most of our clients and the communities in which we work, they agree with the ideals. If you laid out everything that smart growth is about, and we do in one form or another in comp planning processes, there's agreement that those are good things. But the truth is that the frequency of planning is less in smaller and rural communities. Plans are more often ignored. If something comes up that doesn't fit the plan, they may just move along and not pay attention to what the plan said. There's limited support for constraints if those constraints might prevent growth. So they agree with the ideals, but if following through on that means saying no or saying not yet until you do X to someone, they're leery about doing that. They much prefer to say yes to someone that shows up and says, I want to invest, whatever that might be. We see that true mixed-use development is rarely market feasible, and so more often mixed uses occur in a side-by-side format. We can get neighborhood commercial at the edge of a neighborhood, for example, or we can get redevelopment of housing, maybe multifamily housing at the edge of a business district, but true mixed-use development is not that common in rural areas. We see that the housing mix is more limited, and though we're making progress, by which I mean that I think there's a growing awareness, especially since the recession, of the need for multifamily type units, for the need for rental housing, and I certainly see in my clients and stakeholders gradually increasing appreciation for a variety of housing types. We see that multimodal transportation just really isn't a realistic option for the vast majority in rural communities. Transit doesn't exist in many places, and walking and biking occurs more often for exercise than actually for transportation. And then the last thing that we wanted to note is that the convenient, free, and low-cost parking is still a high priority. And I think that that doesn't really mesh with what we think of when we think of smart growth. So a couple of slides here. First, to talk about this notion of development at the edge versus development downtown. This is a community in rural Illinois, Mount Morris, that wants their downtown to succeed, but also wanted in their plan to show just swaths of red for commercial along their highway corridor. And we did some of that. We reserved some space for residential infill out there. But then when Dollar General came and said, well, we'd like this site, they just went ahead and did that. There wasn't any effort to amend the plan beforehand. And then one more example to talk about that parking issue. The city of La Crescent, Minnesota is fairly progressive, community of 5,000, and interested in downtown infill, in revitalizing their downtown, but wanted in their plan, their comp plan, a goal about maintaining parking as convenient and free, because they feel that's part of their character. Relative to other more urban communities in the metro area that they're part of, that's part of their character. So as you see on the right, they have right now wide streets with angled parking so that they can really pack people in. They've got some corner parking lots. This is their main intersection downtown, and they have public parking in a couple of places. And so the challenge that we've had to deal with is doing downtown infill and redevelopment while still respecting that interest in convenient and free parking. So that's my overview in general, and now we're going to dive in and talk about what's happening within each state, and in particular what's happening with the statutory framework and how that relates to planning practices. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie Brown to talk about Illinois.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I'm going to preface this segment with the fact that I was born in Southern Illinois, and I've worked and lived in Central Illinois for the last 10 years. I have no direct experience with planning in Chicago, our most urban area, only what I've learned through colleagues and APA conference sessions. So it's from that viewpoint and some research that I give this presentation. So to start, a brief history. Generally, in Illinois, true planning legislation, when compared to neighboring states, is sparse. These 11 statutes are all that the state legislative research staff were able to find. And really, only a few are referenced regularly. I highlighted those in orange there. Local governments have been given the power through the Local Land Resource Management Planning Act to create what we know as comprehensive plans. But it only states that communities may adopt such a plan. Ironically, though, all other statutes refer to these documents as comp plans, but the statute itself calls them the Local Land Resource Management Plan. There are no requirements for communities of any size to create, adopt, or even follow the semblance of a comprehensive plan, or use smart growth principles for that matter. However, state and federal funding agencies have used the adoption and following of a comprehensive plan as a carrot and stick type method for municipalities and counties to receive funding for any number of projects, from parks and recreation to even downtown revitalization. The rest are basically, statutes here are basically urban renewal acts created mid-century around the idea of blight removal. So in a nutshell, Illinois legislation allows for municipalities to either encourage infill and redevelopment or to plan for the growth around their jurisdiction within their region. But it does very little to get specific on any restrictions or requirements of what goes into a comprehensive plan. So funding. Well, in Illinois, we don't know what that is. If you are unaware, Illinois is broke and only in the last month passed its first state budget in 3 years. So at a time when planning for our future should be paramount, planning dollars are definitely low on the list of state-funded priorities. When the Comp Plan Act was adopted, planning grants were created in conjunction to help develop, update, administer, and implement local land resource management plans as defined in the Act. However, those funds have not been allocated in at least a decade. So today's state-sponsored funding, in a word, is limited. Most recent funds released for comp planning in Illinois were the IKE grants, which were federal emergency dollars funneled through the state to areas which experienced abnormal rainfall and flooding as an effect of Hurricane Ike in 2008. These grants allowed for disaster recovery planning as part of an overall comprehensive plan for affected communities. And in fact, for many of the affected communities, they had never passed, or if they had passed one, had not updated their comprehensive plan since at least the 60s or the 70s. So many of our communities in Illinois do not even have a comprehensive plan to follow, or at least one that meets modern standards. Other sources of funding to encourage smart growth and development our U.S. Rural Development Grants, Community Development Block Grants, our Department of Transportation, our Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and the Environmental Protection Agency. However, the way these funds are administered, they tend to be more on the implementation side, not the planning side. So most of our planning dollars to help encourage good sound planning principles comes from a locally funded general fund or even perhaps our tax increment finance. So what do we plan for in Illinois? Just because there's no state legislation dictating what must go in a comp plan, the existence of 2 accredited schools of planning, UIUC, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and the University of Illinois Chicago, have ensured sound planning principles reside in Illinois, as well as some consistency in the planning documents which are churned out. First, a typical document structure. We typically have the intro exec to begin with, which helps to sell ideas to developers or go after grants. The public engagement process, this is a huge component when going after grants. In the state, you must show that your community is in agreement for this type of use. Also a big sell to many communities who desire a more transparent governmental process as well as placemaking. Existing conditions. Each area or element addressed in the plan is done so through existing conditions. Basically, we need to know where we are to know where we need to go. And then through those existing conditions, goals, objectives, and action steps are identified. And this usually relies heavily on feedback from the public, steering committee, and staff. And then of course we have our future land use chapter, and finally the implementation chapter, which more and more communities are beefing up. All these chapters address the areas and elements of interest to the community, such as mobility, housing, economic development, environmental factors, etc. As I mentioned before, public involvement is paramount for any funding which may come through the state or federal government. Therefore, it's highly desired by communities. While it varies from place to place, most communities hope for this: the harmonious gathering where ideas and community come together for the greater good. Simultaneously, most communities fear this: the pitchfork-bearing citizens against anything and everything. However, here in Illinois, and I suspect everywhere else, what mostly we get is this: meh, indifference. Generally speaking, planning is embraced in the more urban areas and not as much in our rural areas. However, a controversial issue will always bring out the masses. So what does this mean for traditional smart growth initiatives and their execution or lack thereof in Illinois? To understand this, I'm going to give just a brief geography lesson. So Chicago is the third largest city in the United States with 2.7 million people, and it comes with an even larger metropolitan area of 9.5 million. With 12.8 million in the state, there is definitely a disproportionate distribution of population to land. It's very dense in our northeastern corner and very spread out in what's lovingly referred to as downstate, basically all the light blue area. However, there are large pockets of urbanized areas along the interstates about every 45 to 60 miles. The Quad Cities, Peoria, Bloomington Normal, Champaign-Urbana, etc. It should also be noted that these urbanized areas hold large pockets of municipal planners, where the rural areas rely on consultants or one or two ill-equipped staff. Now, to understand the current development outcomes when compared to typical smart growth principles. Agriculture in Illinois, corn and soy primarily, is the biggest export in Illinois. Illinois boasts the best soils in the U.S., and farmland preservation is a huge component of future land use plans. Most future land use plans do their best to curb boundary growth to ensure that their agricultural uses can continue. Larger communities, do this on their own. However, smaller communities rely heavily on their quasi-governmental metropolitan planning organizations, which have heavy transportation orientation. The cost of agriculture is also a factor in a lot of these rural areas. Ag land in Illinois comes at a premium price, which can instantly curb sprawl, especially in central and northwest Illinois. However, certain development pressures have trumped smart planning in many instances. The most southern portion of Illinois has done very little planning. Sprawl is evident, the soils are poor, and development happens with very little planning or long-term thoughts in mind. There are very few planners per capita in this area as well. Shrinking small towns have also forced regional collaboration on all fronts, from school district consolidation, water and sanitary district expansion agreements, and EMS agreements. The collaboration has prompted smart decline and smart growth based on limited funds and resources. This has forced better development decisions in some instances. Now, when you compare that with our most urban area, the Chicago metro area, it does have specific state statute language, which does require a regional comprehensive plan every 5 years through what was created, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency of Planning. And this agency, CMAP, is geared at integrating land use and transportation. They are a quasi-governmental agency that has access to both public and private dollars. There is still the appearance and existence of suburban sprawl and suburbia, as you can see here on some of these photos, but a renewed sense and pushback to create centers and walkable communities in recent years. CMAP has worked hard to ensure all municipalities and jurisdictions within its 7-county area do work together, plan together, and execute together. The funding and legislation from the state help give their work the teeth they need to execute. The downside is the development pressures and individual councils don't always follow the plans, and sometimes decisions are made without following smart planning. Then downstate, we do have another highly dense urban area known as the Metro East area, which is connected to St. Louis. They work through jurisdictional agreements between counties and municipalities, as well as individual taxing bodies. The Metro East area has built a network of planners in both Illinois and Missouri to ensure sound planning and execution across state boundaries or the Mississippi River. In the end, Illinois has very little legislation to convey, let alone enforce planning or smart growth principles. However, thanks to many communities embracing planning and the idea of smart growth in relation to capital improvements, long-term maintenance, and available resources, good planning still prevails in much of the state. Illinois' lack of involvement has not failed many communities where planners are in existence. We have seen signs of redevelopment, infill, controlled suburban development, and planning around walkability and mobility. However, in those extreme rural areas, development help is needed, as evidenced by the poor sprawling decisions and lack of planning. The Illinois chapter of APA has recently revived their legislative committee, as well as set goals and volunteer planners out to educate citizen planners. With these forces, APA-IL is stepping in where our state has not, to educate and arm locals and government officials with the information needed to sustain their community's resources and encourage economic development, thus enforcing the smart growth principles, with or without state legislation and their current lack of funding. And for all my fellow Illini participating today, ILL.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. Michael, I will start with Iowa and then talk about Minnesota, basically same kind of stuff. So starting with the Iowa experience. So 1923, we had our first Zoning Enabling Act, and that pretty much lasted up until 2010 without too many changes. It required that zoning regulations be in accordance with a comprehensive plan. That was about it. That was the definition of a comprehensive plan, and what it was going to be and how it was used was basically that line right there. No legislation or definition. And then on top of that, we had the Supreme Court in several instances either made statements or rulings that supported that a comprehensive plan would not be required for a city to adopt zoning or a county, and that they didn't have to necessarily make any decisions based on an adopted comprehensive plan. So in general, the state did not require smart growth plans and did not support them. That all changed it started to change in 2008, and there had certainly been efforts prior to that to define what a comprehensive plan was, to talk about which elements would be in it, that type of thing, what every city should consider, what county should consider. But in 2008, we had a lot of flooding that basically decimated most of in a lot of bigger cities experienced a lot of flooding, especially in the eastern part of the state, which is the denser part of Iowa is definitely the east part of it. So we had a lot of flooding, and in turn, we had a lot of people starting to think about how can we plan better to avoid this type of destruction and property damage and that kind of stuff. And there was an opportunity there where the Iowa Flood Center and the Iowa APA and a number of other organizations came together and said we need to do some smart planning legislation. And it was based on smart growth principles and enacting those and finding a way to figure out how to get those into the legislation and into the rules for how a comp plan is done. So they came up with this Iowa Smart Planning legislation. It was enacted and signed in April of 2010. It included 13 plan elements that were well defined and 10 principles for smart planning in Iowa. Cities and counties, basically the wording is shall consider smart planning principles, but it is not mandatory. So there is not a lot of teeth in this, but it does give us a lot more direction than we had previously. On the other hand, our metropolitan planning organizations and our council of governments or rural planning commissions are required to address smart growth planning principles. And again, those are some quasi-governmental funded agencies, and so they had a little bit more teeth in that they do have to address these when they do comprehensive planning for any of the communities or counties that they service. Basically, what it provided was an outline for the process and for the adoption of plans, which there was a lot of good practice going on prior to this, but it basically said, okay, you need to have a planning commission or plan and zoning commission look at this, and then it needs to go to council, and there has to be public hearings and those types of things. That wasn't always done in the past everywhere. It outlined that process. So the end result, the state is promoting smart growth plans in many ways. Funding, most plans are still funded by local general funds. Occasionally, there has been a smart growth comprehensive planning grants. When they first came out, the Iowa Department of Economic Development, and it's now called the Iowa Economic Development Authority, found some CDBG money to put towards helping a lot of communities enact smart growth planning to kind of kick it off, which was really helpful. There has not been any annual or any appropriation of funding really for it since then. And so there's no steady state funding for comprehensive smart growth planning. However, there are a lot of communities and a lot of the more urban areas that find ways to identify other sources of funds and use those for smart growth planning to help out with that cost. But again, most of the plans are funded by just the local general fund in a city or a county saying, hey, we're having an issue with growth, we want to address this, it's been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is since they last looked at this, and they appropriate the funds and go forward with it. Typical plan structure, again, and this is now in 2010, since 2010, since we had smart growth planning legislation, most cities and counties are providing and looking at all of those elements and principles of our smart plans. But the tenets that are holding it are still public participation, issues and opportunities, land use and implementation are still the really big parts of any comprehensive plan that all communities are focusing on. And then depending on what their needs are, they look at the other ones, be it infrastructure, character of the community. A lot of the times if we are working in a rural area that is seeing a lot of growth, maybe it's on the fringe of a community, they're seeing a lot of growth that they may or may not be comfortable with. They certainly enjoy some of the benefits of growth, but they also see their character changing, so that's one that they tend to focus on a lot. Hazards, if it's a community that's recently had a lot of flooding damage or tornadoes or whatever it is, they will tend to look at that. There's also been a huge effort to do hazard mitigation planning by the councils of governments and the MPOs across the state. And so a lot of hazard mitigation planning has been done already and can be utilized as part of the comprehensive planning process. Agriculture and natural resources, as Stephanie was saying, Iowa is still a major exporter of agricultural products. And so those are important as well. But again, public participation, issues and opportunities, land use and implementation are the big ones that most people focus on. So, state-supported uses of comprehensive smart plans. Zoning decisions and appeals, especially if there's some conflicting issue and it ends up going to some type of court to figure out, was this in accordance or was it not? Was it supported, was it not? Annexations go through our the City Development Board still looks at comprehensive plans, or does look at them when they look at annexations, especially involuntary or annexations. A lot of inclusion in regional plans. So the councils of governments and the MPOs and the counties do a lot of regional planning. There's also been a big effort to do watershed-based planning in Iowa lately and some funding for that. A lot of the smart planning principles and a lot of the smart planning that's already been done becomes a part of those efforts by the MPOs, the COGs, and the watersheds to do their planning. And then funding leverage. Most of the stuff that comes from the Iowa Economic Development Authority asks, is this in accordance with your comprehensive plan? If you're applying for some type of infrastructure funding for public facilities expansion or community facilities or a downtown revitalization grant, that type of thing, they want to know, is this in accordance with the comprehensive plan? So a lot of communities are rewriting their plans from 20 years ago with these smart growth elements and principles in mind to help them find additional funding for other projects. Public perception, in general, people love the public process. They love that it's a guide for investment for them a lot of times, especially if they're having issues with capital improvement planning. They love the analysis. They like to know that diversity is financially sustainable, and when I say that, I mean they understand that they need different housing options and not just everybody lives in a single family $250,000 house and then character. And they want to be able to find initiatives that can last through one council's turnover session or through a mayor or into the next public works director or whatever it is. Not helpful views is smart planning can fix all private property issues, is them assuming that a plan is too much and that it's going to fix everything. In the end, as Jason said much earlier, in general, and this is not probably just a Midwest thing, but housing diversity tends to be bad. If you tell somebody, we have a lot of arguments about, well, a new teacher or somebody just graduating from high school isn't going to buy a single family house in your community for what you're wanting to build them at. How are you going to deal with that? That argument is still a tough one to make, and they don't see diversity in housing as a good thing. Comp planning is more regulation. You always have those folks. You have you're not going to let the market decide what to do, folks. And then people, they want to fix their communities. Many of the times we'll go into a place and they'll be like, man, this place is a dump. And then once we get to the end of the planning process, they're like, well, don't change anything. You know, that would be horrible. Apathy is a huge one. And then one of the ones I see all over the place is the school districts and cities aren't planning together. And this is especially hard on shrinking communities where they're seeing school consolidation in the rural areas, or are suburban growth areas where the schools are growing at one rate and the city is growing maybe at another in general terms of how they're planning for that growth. Outcomes, again, that urban-rural split is crucial, because while our urban areas can be definitely more focused on what type of growth they want to see and what it's going to look like, and is it smart in nature, does it have those principles, does it meet those, does it take all those elements into account? We have rural areas that if somebody says they're going to put in a storefront in an empty building like I'm showing here, they're not going to say no to much if it comes down to it. Some of the organizations we have helping are the Urban Land Institute in Iowa has definitely taken a big role, along with the MPOs and AARP recently, in pushing smart growth, walkability, sustainable type practices in Iowa. And then the Iowa Council of Governments, the Iowa Association of Council of Governments, which is the association for the Council of Governments and the Rural Planning Commissions in the rural areas, has taken up a big torch to help move smart growth principles forward. And all of those groups and a lot of the professionals within them are networked through the Iowa APA. So we're seeing a lot of good planning across the state. It has to address those two different areas. The Minnesota experience, and I will admit I am not as experienced in Minnesota as I am in Iowa. I've definitely been working up there, had worked as a planner up there for a while, but my breadth of experience is not as much. In 1929, they enacted zoning for townships and counties and cities. And it may acquire, prepare, and adopt. It basically says may acquire, prepare, or adopt a comprehensive plan for the future physical development and improvement of such city or village. Basically, zoning controls and comprehensive plan relationship, it's not really well defined, and there's no strict guidance on the contents of a comprehensive plan in Minnesota, and that is still the case in the rural areas. Now, on the other hand, in the Twin Cities area, Chapter 473, which was adopted in 1976, created basically the Metropolitan Land Planning Act and the Metropolitan Council, which is a regional authority over 7 counties around that include Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then around that area. And they basically have regional planning authority over utilities, parks, housing, land use, transportation planning. So a lot of good planning comes out of that act that enabled them, but they're supported by state law, and they require regional smart growth planning and continue to move the ball forward as they do plans. Funding, again, most plans are funded by local general funds in Minnesota. There's no steady state funding for comprehensive smart growth planning, and Minneapolis, St. Paul Metro, the Metropolitan Council does provide grants for every tenure they do plan updates. There are varying qualifications, so they kind of choose what they're going to try to subsidize with grants, basically, and what type of planning based on varying qualifications and what they feel their needs are at that time. Typical plan structure in the Metropolitan Council area, that is, they change again. They go through this cycle where they start after a census period, and they do their regional development guide, do their regional planning, and then move it down to the counties and the cities and townships that are in their area and how they do their planning. currently they're planning for 2040, and the elements that are required in every plan are land use, transportation, water resources, parks and trails, housing, resilience, economic competitiveness, and implementation. Statewide, again, there's not that Met Council typical plan structure in all of those elements, but most of the plans that we see in the non-Met Council areas in Minnesota, again, revolve around public participation at some level, whatever the community or county or township wants to see, their issues and opportunities, of course land use, and then implementation, and they focus on the things in between that are important to them. State-supported use of comprehensive plans, Met Council, future regional planning, funding and plan amendments is obviously a big one, and then again, the other ones, zoning decisions, annexations, regional planning and funding leverage are all important in Minnesota as well. Public perception. So not a lot different in many areas than what I shared in Iowa in terms of people like the inclusiveness, they like the public participation, they like talking about how to improve their communities, that type of thing. What I have found in working in both metro urban areas within the Met Council area and the more suburban or exurban areas in the Met Council, that 7-county area, is that there is sometimes differing opinions about how helpful the top-down Met Council regional approach is, and whether, you know, if the rural areas agree with everything that's being done regionally or not. It's just one of those differences of every community and on particular issues that come out of those. Outcomes, basically same sort of thing, urban and rural. You see a lot of the urban areas are focused on smart growth planning. All of those principles make sense to them, and we see a lot of the things in the rural areas as well. It's just that policy argument is a little bit different. What we see in practice is that the Met Council drives a lot of, there are a lot of planners from Minnesota that are involved in some way, shape, or form with the Minnesota APA and the Metropolitan Council in that area, and then also the Minnesota Association of Development Organizations. And then there's other organizations like Strong Towns, and I'm sure a number of others that are also looking at different issues that affect planning, affect people's lives, quality of life, that type of thing, and how smart growth planning can help those both in those urban areas where it's much more accepted and understood and clicks very well, and the rural areas that find a harder time actually pulling the trigger on, again, as Jason said, saying no to some of those developments and ideas and concepts that may not meet the smart planning principles.
We're going to go over to Jason again.
I'll bring it home by completing the circle to talk about Wisconsin. And if you know anything about Wisconsin's story, you're familiar with the smart growth law, and I'll walk through that here. Prior to 1999, the statutes authorized local governments to create land use plans and economic development plans, and those were kind of the two basic categories of planning that were acknowledged in statutes. But there was concern through the 90s that what we were doing in Wisconsin wasn't adequate to protect what we felt we had in our communities and in our landscape. Concern about suburban sprawl, concern about the development of the lands in the North Woods for second homes, people coming out of all of the metro areas in the Midwest to use those northern Wisconsin for fun and vacation, and so concerns about environmental health, and all of that led to the development of an organization, 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin, that I believe was created really with the focus of establishing some kind of stronger regulatory framework for planning in Wisconsin. And so the 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin coalesced around this idea and pulled together a group of supporters for state legislation that would require comprehensive planning. And that group included the realtors and builders who said, yeah, having predictability in the development process and in the growth process for our communities is a good thing for us too. And so with that coalition in place, the Thousand Friends of Wisconsin was successful in influencing our legislators, and ultimately our governor. And then we have our longtime Republican governor, Governor Thompson, signing, I believe that's actually signing this Act 9 back in 1999. And approving this legislation. So what does it do? In a very brief terms, it defines what a comprehensive plan is and must contain. It requires consistency between what the plan says and certain actions by that local government as of January 1st, 2010, so it was on a delay. And that was really the core of it, but to give you a little more detail, if you're not familiar, the definition of a plan, according to our statute, is that a valid plan has 9 elements: issues and opportunities, housing, transportation, utilities and community facilities, agriculture, natural and cultural resources, economic development, intergovernmental cooperation, land use, and implementation. And many of the plans that I worked on and many of the plans that I've seen from the early years of the early 2000s after this statute went into place were organized like that. There were 9 chapters, and each chapter included all the content that the statute indicated needed to be included. More recently, we and many others have taken liberties with that format, understanding that the content needs to be in there, but it can be distributed in a way that makes for a better document and easier use by the end user, whoever that might be. The law requires that a comp plan is going to be updated, fully updated, at least every 10 years. And so that's including a review and update of the background data that the statute requires be collected, and review and update of the policies. And then the law establishes that there are certain decisions, and the most important ones are those related to zoning, to land division, and to official mapping of future rights of way, that any of those decisions, so if you are amending an ordinance or you are changing someone's zoning for a particular parcel, that decision needs to be consistent with the plan. And again, that went into effect roughly 10 years after the legislation was passed in January of 2010. So there was funding. So that was the stick, arguably, saying thou shalt do this. And if you want to regulate land use in any way, basically. But there was also a funding program created at the same time, and the state distributed over the course of 10 years about $21 million in funds, and they have this map that shows that the vast majority of jurisdictions in the state managed to be part of a grant-funded process at some point in that period. That funding doesn't exist anymore, so it expired in 2010, and we no longer see any other state funding at this point, with the exception of entitlement communities that can come up with, that can use CDBG monies for planning purposes, and sometimes rural communities too can leverage CDBG funds and get a grant to fund planning. For the most part, comprehensive planning is using local revenues. So what are the outcomes of having this legislation? As of 2015, and not a whole lot changed between 2010 and 2015, so let me back it up to 2010. By the deadline, about 80%, a little more than 80%, had adopted plans, and some were still working. So this map shows that there's only a few in the light, in the green, that either weren't planning or the state just wasn't sure. The vast majority of the local jurisdictions, and there's close to 2,000 local jurisdictions, because in Wisconsin, town government is relatively strong, and towns have the authority in many cases to be regulating land use. And so this requirement for planning extended to hundreds and hundreds of local town governments, distinct from incorporated cities and villages, and distinct from the counties in which those towns reside. And so we see across Wisconsin that the towns or townships have plans, and the overlying county also has a plan. And there are some differences. Sometimes, most often, the county kind of rolls up the local decisions. In other cases, the county creates its own plan, and there's tension. And the county may or may not accept and adopt as their own the town's plan. And then the question is, who controls the zoning ordinance? Who controls the land division ordinance? Because that's when it really that's where the rubber meets the road. So the legislation resulted in plans being created, and so some of the other outcomes, I would say that, generalizing here, there is much greater use of plans to guide land use decisions. There's no doubt about that. These plans have been created, and the plans are being used, and in the process of evaluating land use proposals, land divisions, etc. The adherence to that consistency requirement varies quite a bit. In that there are some communities I know that sometimes they're paying attention, sometimes they're not. They're willing to make a decision without following the plan or without amending the plan first. And then there are other communities that always follow the plan, and if they're not going to follow the plan, they will amend the plan because they don't want to be subject to a lawsuit if they don't. And this is very much an urban-rural divide, or a high-growth or low-growth divide. We are seeing more frequent updates of plans than prior to the legislation, so people are thinking on a more regular and frequent basis about what's changed in recent years and how the plan needs to be amended. But again, practices there vary widely. We're seeing many, now that we're out more than 10 years on many of the plans that were created under the legislation, more urban communities, growing communities, are following through and updating their plans. Rural communities, especially the hundreds of towns around the state that don't have growth pressure, they're not doing anything. And then, thinking about how does all this affect actual development, it seems as if the scale of greenfield development and suburban sprawl has slowed, but it's really hard to tease that apart from the effects of the Great Recession. And so I think it's going to be a while yet before we can really say what has been the result of whether it's had an impact on the consumption of land for community growth and development. So it's worth noting that there have been routine attempts over the years to repeal the law, to gut the law, but there have been very few changes, even through recent periods when we've had both the legislature and the governor's mansion have been held by conservatives. And it's also worth noting that there have been no court tests so far. So we're waiting to see someone challenge a local decision to say that what they did wasn't consistent with the comprehensive plan and take it to court. So far that hasn't happened, I think mostly because those places that have the likelihood of contested decisions are being more careful. So just a few more notes here. How does the outcome relate to smart growth practices? This is from La Crosse County, Wisconsin, and you'll see if you look closely a lot of yellow and orange. Those are areas planned for development in local comprehensive plans, not yet developed. And this comes from some work we did for the county, or really for the MPO there, looking at regional growth and seeing that when we added up all the comp plans, we found that there was a 120-year supply of land for development based on likely growth rates. And so each individual jurisdiction, and in particular suburban and rural jurisdictions, are planning for more growth than is really warranted. The other thing I would note is that as compared to smart growth principles, one of those principles is planning for the edge condition and trying to maintain kind of a distinct edge between what is urban development and what is rural preservation. This is a community in the Madison area, village of Wanakee, town of Westport, that really wanted that said, these are community separation areas and we are not going to violate those if we can help it at all, so that we maintain separation between us and other municipalities around us. But this is the exception to the norm. In most of my work, and I think Chris and Stephanie would agree to me, this is a pretty low priority issue, trying to maintain a clear and distinctive community edge and to prevent nearby communities from growing together. Most often that I've seen that issue fall by the wayside. So a couple critiques of Wisconsin's smart growth law. Overall, it's been good for planning. There's more people that are familiar with comprehensive planning and the principles of good planning, and plans are widely used. Policy categories are have been enforced by the state, or at least they were through the grant program, making sure that you've got a policy that addresses everything that the statute says. But the policy content, what do you say about that, that's not enforced at all. And so there have been plenty of plans that I've seen, and even some I've been part of, that I would say they're not really smart growth. They're just growth plans. The statutes require a lot of detail regarding the types of data that have to be included, and probably went a bit too far. It's a little too prescriptive. And it kind of resulted in these big generic documents. I say generic because there were a lot of plans that had to be created, and they're often multi-jurisdictional planning efforts. And I think that left some bad impressions, especially in more rural areas, about what comp planning is all about, and some feelings about what less than positive. We probably need, if there are going to be changes approved to the legislation, what we probably need is the creation of a light version that establishes what planning means in a place that's low growth or no growth, and makes it easier to do planning without having all the weight of that full comp plan as defined by the statutes right now. And the last thing I would note is that calling it smart growth was likely a mistake, because that led people in rural areas to start questioning what smart growth is, and to look that up and to find that smart growth was mentioned by the UN. And so we certainly heard about Agenda 21 and this notion that this is some global initiative that is being imposed upon us locally. And I think some of that sentiment could have been avoided simply by changing the nomenclature a bit. The smart growth principles are built in there, but to actually call it smart growth, I think may have been a mistake. But overall, main takeaway in Wisconsin is that this legislation that was successfully passed and has been defended over the years has been good for planning and good for getting people to understand what good planning, what smart planning is. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it back to you, Michael, to give us a chance to hear and talk about questions.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Stephanie and Chris. We're now going to move into the question and answer session, and a number of folks have been sending in questions along the way, and you can continue to send them as we move forward through this by using the dashboard on your screen. So to get started, we're going to make everybody able to respond to these. I'm curious, one of the things, I thought this was really a great summary of what's happening in the Midwest, and we do see that there is some variation amongst the state. But I guess in your positions as being able to see all of this happening, to what degree, given the variation but a lot of the similarities, how do you kind of share best practices amongst the communities that you work with, and do you kind of share, based on this knowledge, your methodologies in doing comprehensive plans in different areas? Or how much do you share that or differ?
Sure, I guess I'll tackle that first. This is Jason again, and I think, as in places where the contents of a plan aren't defined, because we're doing plans in places where they are defined, we've got our own opinions and recommendations for a community about the topics to include. And so in work that I've done in rural Minnesota, where there's really nothing to define it and they can make it up as however they see fit, it still ends up looking pretty much like all the plans that we do. So there's that piece of it, you know, what's the structure, and then kind of on the policy side, what are the how do you cross-pollinate good policy, good design, good ideas? I think that comes through naturally, you know, from us. We are doing work all over the place. We share amongst one another as colleagues. We go to conferences and we're hearing from other people that are, you know, APA members, and that comes out in our work. And so people ask, you know, we get questions from communities. Well, how do you tackle this problem, whatever this problem is? And, you know, it might be a housing investment problem. And so, you know, we've got stories to tell from our own work and the work of others that we've seen.
Okay. And as we move on, if anyone else beyond the person who responded wants to add to that, you can please add to your response there. So to go on to other questions, one person asked, it appears that Wisconsin's planning experience is more robust and a higher priority than the other states in the Midwest. Do you think that's so, and in what sense is it different?
Well, the critical difference is the consistency requirement. So the statutes say you must make zoning decisions consistent with the plan, and so the plan has taken on greater weight. The statute requires that it be adopted by ordinance, so the plan is an ordinance, and you see the plan included in the process as a matter of course, because it has to be included in the process. Occasionally, like I said, rural areas, communities that don't feel that anyone's really paying attention, they may be loose about it, but for the most part, it is routinely part of the process. And I think that's the critical difference, is that it's simply required by law here.
Okay. It was interesting to see your map, and I know in Wisconsin, having grown up there myself, the townships play a very central role. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of the township plan to the counties, and to what extent, you know, maybe give us a little bit more context on how that occurs?
Yeah. So like I said, it depends on where you are in the state. In most places, the county simply collects the plans and rolls them up into one map and says, here's our county plan, at least from a land use planning perspective. And sometimes they have to do some massaging, because different towns will create different definitions or different categories, and so to have it make sense, they have to do some adjustment to say, okay, well, that category is like this category, and so they make some adjustment. There are places such as Dane County, and so Madison here is in Dane County, and is probably the one of the most contested or most difficult places for that relationship between the town and the county, in that the county leadership often disagrees with the town leadership, where the towns are happy to allow growth and the county leadership is saying, no, we want to push the growth into the municipalities, and we want you to have as little growth as possible. And so the county has resisted adopting plans that they disagree with. They have outright refused, or they have tried to get it to change before it's adopted, and I've been part of processes where they just go round and round in circles like that for years. Recently, the legislature gave towns in Dane County the opportunity to get out of county zoning, meaning the towns could create their own zoning ordinance. And because that's really the lever through which this is enforced, and they were prevented, the way the statutes are set up, they're prevented from leaving the county zoning ordinance. The legislature gave them a path out, and several are taking that path so that they're not beholden to the county's opinions about what their local land use should be. So it can be very simplistic, and it can be very contentious.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, we have a question for Stephanie that someone asked. How does your comprehensive planning process handle interjurisdictional planning issues and land use conflicts across jurisdictional boundaries? So kind of a similar question maybe for Illinois.
Sure. Well, the way it works in Illinois is we do have the 1.5 ETJ, the not terrestrial, goodness. That's a whole new conversation.
That is comprehensive.
Territorial.
Very comprehensive, yes. Anyway, we have the 1.5 planning, and wherever there are boundary overlaps, there are agreements that can be worked out between jurisdictions. There's kind of a first come, first served basis. So if I get my plan in and I plan that area first, I win. And then you can make agreements from there too. This happens a lot, especially in rapidly growing areas. I mean, I live in the Champaign-Urbana area, and it's really hard to tell where one community begins and one ends. So there is a lot of coordination that does happen between municipalities, especially when you're looking at resources, you know, roads, jurisdictions, our MTD, transportation enhancements, all of that. So there is power to plan within those areas. But like I said, a lot of our communities are so spread out with so much rural in between that usually it falls to the county to plan those areas not claimed by a municipality.
Gotcha. Okay. So here's again a similar question for Christopher. And the first part of it is similar to what we were just talking about, but what is the relationship of smart growth planning between municipalities and counties, and do counties encourage annexations and promote compact development on public water and sewer?
It depends is the best way I can answer that. And for it, I would say that a lot of counties that we've worked with that are, if the county is doing smart growth planning, if they are focused on that, then yes, they would prefer that urban type development at that density occur within a city and be annexed. And the other thing I'll note, just jumping back a little bit, is Iowa does not have, we have townships, but they have no land use regulation authority. The cities and counties were the only ones enabled in Iowa. So, so we have some counties that have never adopted a zoning ordinance or a comprehensive plan. So that is out there. They didn't have to, but we don't have that, the issue of townships also throwing their hat in the ring. But yes, if the county is practicing smart growth, then I would say my opinion would be that, yeah, they want to see most of the urban style growth within urban areas and not spread out within the county. Now, there are other counties that certainly entertain or did entertain at one point or may entertain in the future large lot rural residential growth. And there's a market for it, and many of the counties in Iowa that we've worked with have said, well, the market's there, we want to find the best way to facilitate that. And that also happens.
Okay. And maybe broaden it out a little bit. How can you get property owners in rural communities to talk about their property being used for smart growth when balancing property rights?
The discussion usually starts to center around that a comprehensive plan in Iowa is a guide, and you know, inevitably I fall back on that your elected officials are ultimately the city councils, county board of supervisors are ultimately the ones that make the final decision on development and approval of it and that type of thing. So we start to preface with that we're not shaking up the natural order of how the politics work in small rural areas. And then we come in with this is a guide. How do you want your community to look? And a lot of times I find in rural areas focusing on that character piece is a huge help to selling, for lack of a better way to say it, some of the other principles of smart growth that people that they agree with. They just, again, I would totally agree with Jason about, I haven't had as much experience with the Agenda 21 folks and the smart growth connection to that, but it has come up several times. But we try to focus on the things that are important to them, and then pull back in some of those elements and sell them on how they can get to where they want if they approach planning and the development of their communities and the redevelopment of their communities, in many cases in rural downtowns, and talk about smart growth principles.
Got it. Okay, so here's a broader question for everyone, and you all can decide who is going to answer it. Part of smart growth is preserving farmland and natural areas for local food, green infrastructure, and so on. Have you written, or do you know of any TDR ordinances in the states that you work in?
I'll take the first crack. So in Wisconsin, there have been some efforts and a few successes that I'm aware of with either PDR or TDR, purchase or transfer of development rights. And so I think all the ones I'm aware of are in Dane County. I'm aware of a township or a town that created a PDR program so that they could just purchase those rights, and then the county for many years was trying to create TDR, and I think it got as far as creating an actual functional ordinance in a couple of towns, and that's about it. A countywide ordinance or program was never created. So sporadic and not widely used would be my bottom line on TDR.
Same thing for Iowa. We have several of the larger counties that have more urban areas and more pressures on agricultural resources within them have taken up and allowed and provided for transfer development rights, but it's certainly not a norm, nor is it a huge practice.
Yeah, the most I've heard is around Chicagoland, and even then I don't know how widely practiced or used it has been, because I haven't heard hardly anything in a couple years, but nothing downstate to my knowledge even attempted.
Got it. Okay. As we were speaking, one of our participants here said that there may be one in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, although I'm not familiar with that. Jason, I don't know if you've worked there at all.
I haven't,
okay.
But I wouldn't be surprised to learn that they have one. I haven't heard about it. I'd love to hear the story of how it's actually gone for them.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, this isn't a totally interactive session.
Understood.
Comment.
That was an invitation for that person to reach out to me.
Okay. We will pass that along. I think you probably just did. Okay. So to move on to the next question, some rural communities in California still maintain a gold rush period of buildings, and the local communities do not want to see smart growth ideas that will affect the sense of history of their economic downtown. Does the Midwest have the same issues? And if so, what kind of smart growth aspects can be included in these historic downtowns?
I'll take a shot. I don't know that we have a real distinctive. We maybe don't in Wisconsin. We don't have as maybe as distinctive a specific period, kind of gold rush period. But there certainly are downtowns that are very. They were well created originally in terms of nice buildings, and they're well preserved today. And in those places, generally what you're talking about is trying to invest in the preservation of those buildings, but to still make them useful, so adaptive reuse of those buildings. And then there are other places where the conversation just isn't about that, because the buildings that are there aren't really worth saving. And so I think it's mostly about the quality of the buildings that remain. I think that the smart growth principles can easily be applied. We're generally not talking about major, huge development that would kind of blow out of the water whatever small original downtown had been there, such that people either ignore it or it goes away entirely. So I don't think that in Wisconsin we don't see much of kind of the speed and the scale of development is not such as compared to what I think happens at times in places like California. So that's my Wisconsin answer.
Yeah, I'd have to piggyback on that for Iowa, and the places in Minnesota where I've worked. It's building by building, lot by lot. There isn't vast districts being, taken out of commission and redeveloped at a time, especially when they're historic. Many of the river towns along the Mississippi certainly have very important cultural and character building downtowns that are the heart of their community that they will work to preserve, and anything added to those or redeveloped is again piece by piece and adaptive reuse, as kind of like Jason was saying. And then the other big building that that historically was in Iowa was agricultural and railroads. So you find those towns that were on old rail lines or that were huge agricultural centers. Sioux City comes to mind. Council Bluffs, Iowa comes to mind. Council Bluffs was a big railroad town, still is. Sioux City was a huge meatpacking town back in the day of cattle drives and that kind of thing. They have a lot of historic pieces that they are trying to preserve and continue to maintain and reuse and have vibrant as part of their identity.
I'd say Illinois is similar. The one thing that my community is actually experiencing is the evolvement of campus town. University of Illinois is located here in Champaign-Urbana, and the main drag, if you will, for campus is known as Green Street. And in the last 5 or 6 years, development has literally skyrocketed. I know Jason and I both showed a picture of one of the buildings that's down there, but a 25-story high-rise is now not uncommon for Green Street. This 6-block, I think it's 6-ish blocks of campus town, which basically connects Champaign's downtown to Urbana's downtown. And so while the historic preservation is not there, definitely that changing skyline is, and what is too dense for our area and what is too tall, and how does that affect your experience when walking through Green Street. And so it's prompted some discussion on what can happen in both the downtowns in Urbana and Champaign, because now that they're seeing high rises, I'm looking out my window now and I can count 6, 7, 8 tops of buildings, 25-story student housing. And how does that translate to what happens in the downtown as, maybe a hotel wants to move in? How tall is too tall for our downtown? So I have a feeling this conversation is going to start happening more as denser development is acceptable or deemed appropriate for our towns. But how that plays out with preservation, I think right now there are enough holes that no buildings are getting torn down in the name of new development, but it could affect how the look and feel in your experience and character as you move through these towns.
Okay, it's an interesting segue, Stephanie, because the last question I was going to ask you, this one, is besides Illinois, do other planning higher education institutions play a helpful role in promoting smart growth planning practices throughout the Midwest?
For Iowa, yes. Iowa State Extension, which Iowa State's the land-grant university in the state of Iowa, plays a huge part in promoting smart growth planning and has probably led the charge when we had that when it was enacted in 2010, or at least was a great cheerleader for it, and continue to push it through. They have offices in every county across the state, so they're definitely well ingrained and pushing smart growth principles and elements.
Great.
Illinois has, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say in Wisconsin, I don't see many campuses or universities specifically pushing that as an agenda, but I think the town-gown relationship is one that often leads to discussions that are about smart growth. It's about increasing density without destroying neighborhoods, which is an issue that we wrestle with and work on in smart growth. It's about bike and pedestrian and more generally mobility, because the students need it and are willing to use other modes or need to use other modes. You see that becoming you see more successes there in college towns than you do elsewhere because of that population. So I guess that's how how I see it in Wisconsin.
And the one thing I was going to add is the University of Illinois also promotes the University of Illinois Extension offices. And so in a lot of the rural communities, U of I will have an office presence that can be a resource for economic guides, community development guides, just depending on who is in each office. They have agricultural resources, also depending on the type of area surrounding that extension office. So I think it extends beyond, in Illinois, it extends beyond where an actual campus is located, because they do have those outreach offices.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm sure I'll get slapped if I don't make the same point about Wisconsin. We've got, I was thinking about the campuses in college towns, but Wisconsin has a very strong kind of whole state approach to its role, and so we've got a very strong extension program and programs that through the UW-Stevens Point that work on educating citizen planners, in particular plan commissioners, about planning around the state. So in that respect, there's no question that the University of Wisconsin system plays a role in educating and supporting planning throughout the state.
Great. Well, thank you, Jason, Stephanie, and Chris. We have a few more questions, but we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank you again for participating today and really giving us a great overview of what's going on in the Midwest. This concludes our webinar, Smart Growth in the Midwest, an overview of policies and practice. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org in the next day or so. You will be able to find it in our webinar archives, which is available off the main page. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. The Clearinghouse will present other webinars in the near future. Please keep an eye out at smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for more details. So thank you, and we hope that you will join us again next time.